8 African nations qualified for the biggest sporting event on the planet, and now their fans might not even be allowed to watch them play. Tonight, the 2026 FIFA World Cup is facing the kind of crisis that no football tournament has ever seen before. What was supposed to be a celebration of the world coming together is now turning into one of the most explosive geopolitical standoffs in the history of sport. And the question being asked in capitals across Africa, Europe, and beyond right now is simple: should the world even show up? Good evening, I'm coming to you tonight with a story that started as a football controversy and has grown into something much, much larger. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is scheduled to kick off in the United States in just a few months. 48 teams from every corner of the globe were supposed to come together in American stadiums to compete for the most coveted trophy in sport. That was the plan, that was the dream, but tonight that dream is under serious threat. Let's start with what has actually happened, because the facts here are important. The Trump administration has announced travel bans and restrictions covering 39 countries. These are not minor inconveniences. We are talking about policies that for some nations mean a complete ban on entry into the United States. For others, they mean bond requirements of up to $15,000, mountains of paperwork, and visa processing delays that make the whole thing practically impossible for an ordinary person to navigate. Now, here is where football comes in. Of the 9 African teams that qualified for the 2026 World Cup, 8 of them, 8 are from countries now affected by these restrictions. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Senegal, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Ghana, and Cape Verde all earned their place at the World Cup the right way. They played qualifying matches, they fought for every point. Their fans watched every single game. And now those fans are being told that even with a World Cup ticket in hand, they may not be allowed into the country to watch their teams play. Haiti and Iran are in an even worse situation. Their supporters face a complete travel ban, not restricted, not slowed down with paperwork, completely banned. A fan from Port-au-Prince, who saved for 2 years to travel to the United States to watch their national team play, cannot go, period. And the Trump administration has made it very clear having a World Cup ticket does not guarantee entry. Visa approval is a completely separate process, and American authorities can deny anyone at any time for any reason they see fit. Meanwhile, a supporter flying in from Germany or France walks through the visa waiver program without breaking a sweat. No bond fees, no interrogations, no uncertainty, just arrival and celebration. The contrast is impossible to miss. And across Africa, it is being felt not just as inconvenient bureaucracy, but as something far more pointed than that. Now, the reactions have been coming fast. Julius Malema, the leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, a man who never shies away from a fight, has been among the loudest voices calling for African nations to walk away from the tournament entirely. He said flat out that it is not safe to go to America right now. He said this is not just about football anymore. And he made a historical comparison that hit hard across the continent. He reminded people that the world once boycotted apartheid South Africa from international sport to isolate a government that treated people differently based on who they were. He asked why Africa should now reward the United States with its participation when the policies coming out of Washington right now are doing something that looks uncomfortably similar. That comparison is a powerful one, and it was not made by a fringe voice. It is being discussed seriously by leaders and former athletes across the continent. French football legend Claude Leroy, a man who has coached multiple African national teams and holds enormous credibility across the continent, publicly questioned whether Africa should call for a boycott, not as an emotional reaction, as a principled position. He pointed to FIFA's silence and its failure to push back against policies that are discriminating against participants based on where they were born. Former FIFA president Sepp Blatter, who was forced out of his role years ago and who has never stopped criticizing current football leadership, joined the chorus. He told African fans to stay home. Watch from your own country, he said, because attending means giving your endorsement to a political environment that does not welcome you. In the United Kingdom, members of Parliament actually tabled a formal motion urging global sporting authorities to consider whether the United States should even be allowed to host the tournament until it brings itself in line with international norms. That motion cannot force anything. But the fact that elected officials in one of the world's most prominent democracies are putting that idea on paper in a formal setting tells you something about how widely the concern is now spreading. Germany is not just talking about it in Parliament. The country's sports leadership is openly discussing whether a boycott makes sense, particularly in the context of Trump's threats toward Greenland and his aggressive posture on trade with Europe. A German politician named Jürgen Hart went to the newspapers to float the idea publicly. France's sports minister said she does not support a boycott at this point, but in the same breath admitted she cannot predict what happens if things escalate further. Even Denmark, a country that has not yet qualified but could still make it through playoff matches, is seeing fan groups pushing their football federation to refuse participation if they get through. And Iran, after the US denied visas to 4 members of its delegation just for the tournament draw ceremony, threatened to boycott the draw itself. What you are watching is not one isolated country making a complaint. What you are watching is a wave of discontent rolling across multiple continents, threatening to pull the World Cup apart at the seams before a single ball has been kicked. FIFA, for its part, is doing what FIFA always does when things get politically uncomfortable. It is insisting that everything is fine. It is smiling for the cameras. FIFA President Gianni Infantino has been photographed alongside Trump with that familiar smile. But behind the scenes, reports are emerging that FIFA officials are scrambling. They are quietly pressing the US State Department to ease up on the restrictions before the tournament starts because they understand what a catastrophe this could become if it is not sorted out. Let us talk about the money, because that is always part of the conversation whether we like it or not. The 2026 World Cup is projected to generate $17 billion for the US economy alone. FIFA is expecting record revenues from ticket sales, broadcasting rights, and sponsorship deals. Companies have paid billions to put their logos on this tournament. Broadcasters around the world have paid significant fees for the rights to air matches featuring their national teams. Now imagine 8 African teams are not there. Imagine the stadiums empty of the color, the noise, and the passion that African supporters bring to football. Imagine the broadcasters in African markets who paid good money to air those games suddenly sitting on contracts that have become worthless. Imagine the sponsors who invested in a tournament marketed as a global celebration of humanity now looking at an event that excluded an entire continent. Those sponsors will have questions, very expensive questions, and the answers will not be comfortable for anyone. The wider argument being made in Africa goes beyond the World Cup itself, and this is something important to understand if you want to make sense of why the reaction has been so fierce. Africa is in the middle of a political awakening right now. Countries across the Sahel have expelled Western military forces. The expanded BRICS grouping now includes African nations actively building trade and financial relationships outside of the systems that Washington, Paris, and Brussels designed and controlled for decades. The old post-colonial arrangements where African governments needed Western approval for their decisions are being challenged openly by a new generation of leaders. Against that backdrop, the sight of African football fans being blocked at American borders while FIFA's president stands smiling next to Trump is not just a sports story. It is a symbol, and symbols in politics carry enormous weight. The question being asked is whether Africa, having spent years building the confidence to push back against institutions that long treated the continent as a lesser partner, is now going to exercise that same confidence in sport. The uncomfortable truth is that a boycott is a blunt instrument. The people who would suffer most immediately are the players themselves. These are men and women who have trained their whole lives, who have dreamed since childhood of representing their countries on the biggest stage in football, who have sacrificed enormously to get to this point. Taking that away from them because of a diplomatic fight they did not start and cannot control is a real and serious cost. The football associations themselves also depend on World Cup revenue to fund the programs that develop future players, the academies, the coaching structures, the youth tournaments that keep African football moving forward. Walking away from that money is not a symbolic gesture. It is a material sacrifice with consequences that last years, but the counter-argument is this: leverage only works if the threat behind it is real. The credibility of Africa's position in any future negotiation with FIFA, with the US, and with international institutions depends on whether the continent is willing to follow through when the moment actually comes. If African leaders make strong statements and then show up anyway because the money was too good to walk away from, the message sent is that you can treat African fans this way and face no meaningful consequences. That message, once sent, will be remembered. CAF, the Confederation of African Football, has not officially called for a boycott. No national federation has formally withdrawn its team. But the conversations happening behind closed doors are serious. The fact that a coordinated withdrawal involving Morocco, Senegal, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Cape Verde, and South Africa, backed by the African Union, is being openly discussed as a real possibility rather than dismissed as fantasy tells you exactly how deep the frustration has become. For that kind of coordinated action to happen, governments would have to be on board. Football associations would have to act together. Political will at the highest levels would have to align. That is a high bar, but 6 months ago, nobody would have believed the conversation would even get this far. What FIFA is hoping, what many people in football are hoping, is that the US State Department quietly adjusts the restrictions in the coming weeks. Maybe bond requirements get waived for World Cup participants. Maybe visa processing gets expedited. Maybe some accommodation gets made that allows the tournament to proceed without becoming a full public relations catastrophe. That is possible. People on all sides are working toward that outcome. But here is what has already happened, regardless of how this resolves. African fans, players, and officials now know that their presence at a World Cup hosted in the United States is conditional. It depends on policy decisions made in Washington that they have no vote on, no influence over, and no guarantee about. That knowledge does not go away even if the restrictions ease. It changes the relationship between African football and FIFA-hosted events in the United States permanently. What is being tested right now is something that goes to the very core of what international sport is supposed to mean. The entire philosophy of the World Cup is built on the idea that this tournament belongs to the whole world. Every nation, every culture, every football-mad kid who grew up watching their heroes on a screen and dreaming of one day seeing them in person. The moment you create a system where some fans breeze through and others face $15,000 bond requirements based purely on the country written on their passport, that philosophy is not just strained, it is broken. One voice worth hearing in all of this is a veteran football correspondent who has covered multiple World Cups from Germany to South Korea. He made a point that cuts through a lot of the noise. He said that when a country hosts the World Cup, something shifts in that country. The whole world is watching. The pressure to present yourself well, to be welcoming, to show your best face to a global audience, that pressure tends to change how governments behave. His view is that as June 2026 draws closer, the Trump administration will soften. The political calculation will shift, and his advice to South African fans and to African fans broadly is do not miss this moment, because your country qualifying for a World Cup is not something that happens every 4 years without fail. For many nations, it is once in a generation. The experience of being there in the stands, watching your team compete on the biggest stage in football is something that no television broadcast can replace. That is the tension that millions of people across 8 African countries are living right now. The hope that this gets resolved, the anger that it ever reached this point, the dream of being in those stadiums, and the quiet but growing question of whether showing up, even if restrictions ease slightly, means accepting treatment that no fan should ever have to accept. June 2026 is coming fast, FIFA is nervous, corporate sponsors are watching, governments on multiple continents are weighing in, and 8 African nations, having earned their right to be at the World Cup through honest competition, are waiting to find out if the country hosting this tournament actually wants them there. This is your World Cup, this is your moment, and right now the world is watching to see what Africa decides to do with it.